Rosemary, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this interview. So in the article, I talk about the ways in which testimonies of sexual violence by refugee and freed women reveal how Black women and girls really fought to redefine their labor in the turbulent and transitional period of civil war. One of the central premises of the article, really at the foundation of it, is the notion that during slavery, Black women's labor was understood as being intertwined with their sexual accessibility, their sexual availability. So I'm really trying to think about how the notion of sexual availability being at the center of the definition of their labor is then carried over into the period of civil war, and how new agents such as Union soldiers really, and their sort of assaults against Black women and girls really demonstrate the national nature of these assumptions. And so how refugees, contraband as they are termed at one point as well, and later freed women and girls, is really important to emphasize that girls are also entering the military record as well, how they are pursuing sexual justice and really emphasizing that their right to conduct their labor in a way that is free from sexual affronts, from sexual assault, from sexual violence.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit of some stories or some examples of this? You have, as you said, a range of women and girls who you profile and their assault, the men who assault them. So highlight a couple of those.
Yes, absolutely. So I should also mention that new legal legislation during wartime, such as the introduction of the Labor Code, really provides a new a kind of opening of a door or an opportunity for Black women and girls who are shifting in terms of their status to really make claims to their experiences of sexual violence and have that be legally recognized. And so this is a very unprecedented and unique sort of cultural legal moment for African-American women and girls, that for the first time they are recognized as victims of sexual violence in the historical record. And so the two examples that I would...
Could you talk about the law? You mentioned the law.
Yeah, so first there were the articles that were introduced during the war that really were about the conduct of soldiers, right? So enforcing a particular kind of conduct as part of wartime activity. And with the introduction of the Labor Code, we see the strengthening of these existing articles. And so as Union soldiers are, and historian Crystal Feimster talks a lot about this as well. She's another one of the contributors to this special issue. She talks about how the chastity of the soldiers themselves was really the primary concern around this legal, this sort of legal language. And so soldiers were expected to conduct themselves in a manner that did not violate family honor, that did not sexually assault or assault women, any women, right? It's not defined by race. And so through these kind of like a combination of these examples of these articles within the law, Black women and girls were able to really assert themselves and to make themselves be visible as victims of sexual assault within the law.
So again, share an example of that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I wanted to share two examples that really demonstrate the sort of spectrum of two ends of the spectrum of what I'm thinking about in this article. So one example involves a woman called Sarah Buford, who is described as a free or freed woman of color in an area near Chattanooga, Tennessee. And she describes her experience of, this is in 1865, it's like a Saturday night, and a Union soldier, a Black Union soldier named John Lewis, shows up at her home fairly late at night. And she immediately voices some suspicion in her later testimony. So she's sort of running through the events almost in real time. And she voices some suspicion because a Union soldier had already passed by earlier that evening on a routine patrol check. And so John Lewis shows up at her home and tells her that he's conducting this routine patrol. And she is already thinking, well, somebody has already come by here. He then uses his authority as a soldier to sort of coerce his way into her home. He asks her if she has any food or anything to offer him. And what I find super interesting is that as his questioning progresses, she demonstrates the ways that she refuses to play in the games that men who rape play, where she compels him to state explicitly what his intentions were for entering her home. And so there's back and forth, and eventually he asks her if she will be willing to give him, quote unquote, some skin. And she responds to him, "That's a pretty question to ask a married woman." Mm-hmm. And so he then tries to, he tells her that her husband doesn't need to know about this. He offers her some money in exchange. And again, through this story, we can see the evolution of an attempt at sexual assault being sort of reframed, attempts to reframe it as a consensual, transactional, illicit exchange. She then tells him that she could not be depended on by her husband if she engaged in the act, and that she was a married Christian woman before her husband's face and behind his back, and that, God would know her actions. And so I highlight this story as one part of the spectrum because John Lewis is ultimately unsuccessful in attacking her. He obviously is intimidating and threatening her, but he is ultimately unsuccessful and she scares him off. Mm-hmm. And she brings this case to the courts to demonstrate that as a married woman living within the vicinity of this military encampment, I have a right to conduct my life and labor in a way that is divorced from the expectation of sexual violence or sexual assault. And so I see this as a really interesting way that formerly enslaved women are introducing to a more national level or national consciousness, existing moral value systems that they are then articulating through legal language related to, I guess, existing legal understandings of what constitutes sexual violation and what constitutes rape. And so what I mean by that is the meanings of rape at this time were very narrowly defined as, the sort of carnal knowledge of a woman read as a white woman, forcibly and against her will. In order for a sexual assault victim to be understood as a credible victim, then they had to present their respectability and chastity. They had to have this existing sort of moral stature in order to be understood as being violated. And so with Sarah Buford's discussion, with her testimony, she talks in a way that really places herself within this within this female liberal subject position, right? I am this chaste woman and I have been violated, and this needs to be recognized even if there wasn't a physical act of sexual assault and rape. On the other side of the spectrum, another example that really fascinated me as I came across it in the records, and I'd be happy to talk more about the archive itself and all the digging that I went through to find these stories. The next story I have in mind involves a young woman, a girl, 14 years old, called Rachel, who was also in Tennessee and was likely a sex worker working within a brothel. They called it a known, quote unquote, house of ill fame. And she is attacked by a Union soldier. According to the various testimonies around this case, it seems that while the soldier was sort of like fondling her, the upper part of her body, she might have allowed that. But once the soldier attempted to penetrate her, she screamed and she asked him to quit. And despite her association with this quote unquote known house of ill fame, she goes to military court and she brings this case against the soldier. As the court, the officials within the court are questioning her about this case, they ask her why she did not permit the soldier to, have sex with her. And she says, because he was not of my color. And they ask her, was that your only objection? And she says, yes. And so I find this a really fascinating example to bring in because it demonstrates a more sophisticated understanding of consent than the one that existed at the time, right? So she's literally talking about her right to control the borders around her own body and the terms at which she might consent to something and might not consent to something. So those are, two.
So it's really, the process of self-ownership, right? That they're demonstrating here, and in at least related to a labor context, right? That they are women participating in the construction of the Civil War, the finishing of it, and it just really, it's almost like you've captured the very moment when they're asserting these labor rights, really, the right to themselves.
Absolutely. As I said, for Rachel's case, it's likely that she was a sex worker. So this is she's not presenting herself as this chaste, respectable woman. She was likely in this space in her capacity as a laborer, as a worker, more explicitly, and yet she is making the claim that despite my sexual history, or what might be of my sexual history, this is somebody who crossed a line and violated me, and I'm going to seek justice for that.
Right. So, it's just amazing that you uncovered these stories. You said that you could just share a little bit about how you did that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I visited the National Archives and, just found all of these court martials. There is courts martial, as I've learned, and there are so many of them. And so my job was to really just take days on end to really comb through them. Some of the problems that I confronted were the fact that, first, the sort of visibility of Black women and girls was so fraught. Sometimes they are presented as women, whereas these were girls bringing cases forward. Sometimes they're unnamed. Sometimes within the court environment itself, the person being accused was able to cross-examine the women and girls who were bringing cases against them. And so there's all kinds of problems with trying to really tease out these testimonies. And it was just a matter of really taking my time and sitting with the sources and really trying to reconstruct and imagine the context in which they're in and the court environment that they confronted, and the huge courage and bravery that it took for them to really bring their stories to the fore and insist on sexual justice. Many cases did not result in what we would see as like real justice or like a fair sentence or result today. But at the same time, you know, the fact that they brought these stories forward, given the precarious nature of their life, many of these women and girls could expect to continue to live and work in the Union encampment where this person who once assaulted them maybe got let off and continues to work, right? And so they're constantly within this vicinity of this sort of dual notion of figures who are at once the enforcers of their emancipation and also potentially, you know, perpetrators of sexual violence against them.
Mm-hmm. You know, when the Me Too movement started, there are a lot of us in labor history are disappointed about how the framing is simply is isolated to sexual assault, and not you know, framing working class women as part of this dynamic in this kind of relationship. And I think Christopher Phelps in the introduction says, you know, some of us have been at this a long time of thinking about these questions of including legal consent, you know, in women's lives. So could you just share a little bit about how labor history or framing of labor history might contribute to some of these questions?
Yes, absolutely. So I would say as a starting point, my research begins in slavery. And so I am very much excited about the direction that labor history has taken, where it's moving beyond the history of the labor movement and really incorporating other subjects and even earlier histories that slightly predate the sort of more modern labor movement. What's really at the heart of my research, and also in this article, is how one's labor is defined and how that's related to the class in which they are positioned in, right? And so I'm thinking about just very brief examples of service sector workers today, involved in their own sort of like Me Too movement around sexual harassment. And those kind of cases make me think about, well, what does service actually mean? And how does service, the meanings of service relate to the body of the person producing that service? So in this case, many service sector workers are women of color. How do existing assumptions around their racial gender identity then inform the expectations around their service? And I definitely see that as being tied to my own research in this article, where for many of these Union soldiers, they have this existing understanding and assumption around enslaved women's labor, that sexual exploitation was just so fundamental to the survival of the institution of slavery. And so how does that then kind of like how does that then sort of carry over into this Civil War context, right, where they are enforcing the emancipation of these women whose labor has been so defined in this specific way? And I see examples of the service that women and girls are providing for Union soldiers within, you know, the private quarters, or as, you know, servants or as cooks and laundresses, that the very act of providing this service also makes them potentially vulnerable to the assumption that sexual service can be part of that service that they are almost owing to these Union soldiers. So labor history as a kind of general framing, especially as it's expanding to include these early histories, have been really, really helpful for me, just really at the point of defining what labor means and as it relates to people, in this case, Black women and girls who are on shifting legal ground, and their status is just kind of moving around even month by month sometimes.
Yeah, great comments there. And I mean, we have to probably also frame this that, you know, a lot of the resources they had ended after the Civil War too, which makes this an ongoing story, right? The quest for laws that we're still seeking.
Absolutely. I had mentioned very briefly earlier that this is a specific wartime context that they're able to take advantage of and embark on their own battle as part of, you know, the sort of general war, the overall war of this transition from a slave society to a free labor society. But it's absolutely true that you know, during Reconstruction, and especially in the post-Reconstruction era, as we enter into what's known as the nadir in African-American history, many of these developments, they just kind of fall away as, you know, the sort of political power of white Southerners, white Southern men in particular, is redeemed. And Black women are they're confined to a very limited and discriminatory labor market where the only real options for them are as field hands on plantations, or as sharecroppers, you know, tenant farmers, or as domestic servants. And so, you know, I won't say too much right now about how my broader project, book project, kind of talks about this later period, but we see the ways in which there's this sort of moment of possibility during the Civil War that then gets steadily sort of stripped away. And so Black women and girls continue their fight as their labor is defined in new and also in ways that are very much similar to before.
Great. Well, that was another question that I had about the broader project, but could you tell us a little bit about how you came to this subject in general? Obviously, your accent is, you're not originally from the United States, but just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am British. I'm from London, raised and born. I studied at the University of Nottingham, where I did American studies. And from there, I was just super interested in specifically African-American women's experiences. From there, I was able to complete a master's on Black women intellectuals at the turn of the 20th century. So I focused on Anna Julia Cooper, I focused on Ida B. Wells Barnett, and I also had a section where I talked about Pauline Hopkins. And this is to say that my journey to where I am now had a lot of turns along the way, and really fascinating turns along the way. So as I produced my master's thesis on these Black intellectual women, one of the questions that really kept tugging at me was the ways in which they spoke about Black women's sexuality, the sort of assumptions around it, and how they could sort of foster a more positive public image as part of the racial uplift movement to counter these images. As my research developed, so I went on to Rutgers University, where I completed my Ph.D. In the history department under the direction of Deborah Gray White and Mia Bay. I started to think more about not just the sort of assumptions around Black women's sexuality, but how those assumptions were so closely tied to the labor that they were expected to perform, and that they were coerced into performing. And so that brings me to, that's a kind of long way of saying, that brings me to my project now, where I'm talking about a longer history of Black women and Girls' Struggle for Sexual Autonomy. The title, the sort of first part of the title is Weaponizing Virtue. And I use that as a way to really center how notions of womanhood and feminine virtue have historically excluded Black women from its realm, and their exclusion from this realm has been at the root of much of the violence that they've experienced and the kind of labor that they were expected to perform. And so I am interested in tracing how Black women use the language of virtue as a way to launch a form of intimate resistance to their exploitation within the US, within US expansion and later, imperialist goals throughout the 19th century. So I'm making the point that their intimate labor, the abuse of their bodies as women, was really at the heart of the project of slavery and its expansion. And that even after slavery, there continues to be these national concerns with their intimate lives. And so really thinking about how they use the language of their own virtue, so defining it on their own terms, as a way to struggle for sexual autonomy throughout slavery and then beyond into the late 19th century.
Sounds great. We look forward to that wider history. So thank you so much for being here with us. And again, invite everybody to take a look at that essay and other essays in the new issue.
Thank you.